Karen Ferry, welcome back to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you, David. Just lovely to be back again.
Well, it's so good to have you here again. And I'm looking forward to speaking with you about this book that you've written. I want viewers on YouTube, any listeners, know that you can also see this interview on YouTube. And here's a copy of your book, Benson the Boxer. And it's so wonderfully, aside from the wonderfulness of the book and the content, do I have this upside down? No, I've got it right. It's the dog is under the bed and is upside down. So that's what threw me off. But the illustrations really bring the whole thing to life. I just want people to see how beautifully illustrated this is. So this book is fully the equivalent of of just about any other children's book that you would buy. It's a real book. It's paper bound, but it's nice, heavy, glossy paper. And there's a workbook that we're going to be discussing as well. And the workbook is nice and thick. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. And so I want to ask you, what motivated you to write this book, which is a book about grief and loss and death for children? And I don't know that there must be other books out there on that topic, but not that I'm aware of.
Yes, well, David, there are other books out there, but I have done this one specifically from a neuroscience perspective.
That's a unique thing, yeah.
That's a unique thing. And when I was doing my study 5 or so years ago now, 10 years, well, 7 years ago now, I discovered that there is a need out there for psychoeducation for children who experience loss. Benson the Boxer. Benson was actually our family pet. I have 2 sons, and it was our pet. And I do remember the grief that my sons went through when that dog died. And
now, how old were they at the time when that happened?
They were 9 and 12 years old. And when it's been a family pet for such a long time, and it just got me thinking about the grief of children when adults die, when mothers and fathers die. And it actually was an assignment I did which developed into the book, and I sourced an artist, Selena, who has done, as you said, amazing work on bringing this book to life. But it's become a book that I use frequently in therapy now for children that have suffered loss, that it tells the story to give them a feeling of normalization with the experiences, with the emotions they're feeling, because it takes it from the perspective of a dog, which is universal. It's not one person. It's not culturally controversial. And so it came about as just a project really that developed from a thought.
And you were, this was when you were studying, was this after you had finished your master's program and some follow-up work?
Well, it was during the study of the master's program that I did the initial writing of this book, and then it was developed afterwards, yes.
Yeah. And did your kids, while they were still young and at home, did they experience did anybody in the family die where this book came in handy?
No, but I am a school teacher from way back, and I've moved into the field of counselling and neuropsychotherapy. And I certainly experienced in my classroom on many occasions children that suffered loss. In 1 year at the school I was teaching at here in Australia, there were 3 deaths in that 1 year. One little boy from childhood leukemia, one was hit by the school bus, and our secretary died. And in that year, the teachers, I felt we were very ill-equipped on how to manage and how to appropriately deal with the loss the children were going through, the school community, the parents. And During our floods here in Brisbane some years ago, we lost children in those floods when they were washed away
Oh,
by the floods. And once
oh my
again,
goodness.
there weren't resources out there to actually be able to comfort the siblings of these children or the parents. And I felt a great need to write a story and have a simple workbook associated with it so we can move children from a place of loss to a place of moving forward again.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I'm under the impression that you've become a kind of an important resource person there in Australia around these issues.
Yes, I do speak at seminars and I go to schools, but mostly my work is one-on-one counselling, where
Uh-huh.
there wouldn't be a child that comes through my door that has suffered loss that we don't look at the book of Benson the Boxer, and every time they go, now I understand. And I read it to parents. In fact, it's not just a book for children, David. I had a 65-year-old lady the other day who had suffered the loss of her son, just
Oh,
in a stuck place, couldn't move forward, didn't want to go out of the house. And so as you read the book, you'll see that Benson becomes stuck in his fears, doesn't want to go and
yeah.
play anymore, doesn't want to leave the house. Everything becomes scary. The avoidance behaviors very much come into play. And as I read the story, naturally we didn't do the workbook because the workbook is designed for younger children. But as we read through the story, and because she was a lover of animals, she said, I get it. She said, Karen, I get why I'm stuck. So I've used it all walks of life for all different people, gentlemen that have lost their mothers and they couldn't move forward. So we call it a children's book, but I do use it across the age ranges.
That's fascinating. And when she said, I get why I'm stuck, what did she get?
She got that her brain was in a fear-based behavior of not being able to move forward, that she had become so comfortable in her home, not going out, not wanting to return to work, not even wanting to meet friends, but just comfortable because we become comfortable with our discomfort. She didn't like that she was like that. She didn't like the fact that her life was no longer one of fun and meeting up with people that she once enjoyed, but she didn't know how to move forward. So the stuck became apparent to her when she could see from a brain perspective her fears were becoming overwhelming. She was actually developing OCD behaviors, turning off lights frequently, always checking, because her son died at nighttime, so nighttime had become very scary for her. And so she was always looking around the house for imagined fears, which is what we do. Our brain starts to become very hypersensitive. We're in a fear-based state. So she was imagining things that weren't even happening. And this is the story of Benson as well, that he became hypervigilant and everything became very fearful for him.
Uh-huh. Wow. And one of the things that I really liked about the book is that you wove in themes that we know can happen around death and loss and so on, and including possible symptoms of PTSD, and as you just mentioned, OCD, and you get into a discussion about the possibility of guilt, because often the surviving person feels some responsibility that if only they had said or done X, Y, Z, and that can become very burdensome, and that's a place where people can really get stuck. And so I was impressed that what was ostensibly a children's book, went into that kind of depth, but in a way that was not hammering it over your head, in a way that was really true to a children's book, even though it's not limited to children, because particularly the guilt theme is big for adults as well. And then, as you mentioned, there's even basic neuroscience in the story, with a drawing even of the brain inside the dog's head, I guess it was, because the dog was the one who was suffering from at one point the dog is suffering, right, from the loss of a friend.
Yes.
And then as the book goes on, um, oh no, I'm conflating it now. We'll just leave it there. So I love the way that you wove in the neuroscience into the story. And so you've already mentioned that the book can be used by adults. When you sat down to write it, who were you thinking of? Who was your intended audience?
Well, the intended audience was for children because being a teacher, that was the actual intended audience. And I had a lot of parents that were reading the book, and they said to me, "This is wider than a children's book. Naturally, the activities in the manual are more for children, but some of the activities we can use as activities for the adults as well, like framing our fears, and we'll go to that, I'm sure, a bit later on. But the
Yes.
intended audience being children, because as you said, David, the guilt. I don't think I have had a child that's come into my rooms that hasn't had in some form a sense of guilt about the loss of, whether it's a friend or a father. In fact, I had a little girl that lost her father to suicide just 3 weeks ago, and he suicided at night time, and she said, if I'd stayed awake all night, Daddy wouldn't have done that. So she was feeling guilty that she hadn't been awake. So we're working with her on what that looks like for her, and that reframing that actual narrative behind that. But children take on guilt. Now this book, it's talking about death, and we mention that Lucy, Benson's friend, died. We mention those words. We don't hide behind the fact that wondering what happened to Lucy. The book specifically says that Lucy died, which I think we have to come to a place where we are not frightened to talk about death. I think we sometimes use the words passed away, moved on, not here anymore. That can be very confusing to children. So let's state it as it is in appropriate ways, that this person has died, and then work with the child around those emotions associated with it. And for my little girl, she suffered from the nighttime fears, then that if I go to sleep again, will somebody else in my family die?
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
that's when we grow these fears, and then her brother, will he die? So the book written for children, yes, but the parents have taken, in fact, it's for teachers as well, and there's a section in the manual specifically for school teachers that they can read the book in a class situation, for example, but being very aware that this could arouse quite intense emotions for children that have suffered loss, particularly recently, and to be aware and have a counsellor maybe on hand to work with children to notice their reactions, but to provide empathy for a classroom of children that don't know how to react when a classmate comes back to school with the news that their father or their mother or their sibling is now dead. What does that look like for a classroom of children? It's frightening for children, and they have questions. And sometimes as adults, we don't know how to answer the questions. What do we say? Do we approach it? Do we stay away? Do we ignore it? And ignoring it can be probably one of the most devastating things that a person can do, because then it's not recognized, and grief, when it's not recognized, can become even more hurtful.
Yeah, we have weird attitudes towards death in Western culture,
Oh,
and
we
there are
do.
other cultures that somehow are our Western culture. We've managed to kind of sanitize the process of dying and death, and it happens in a hospital often, and we get rid of all the signs of as soon as we can, and we're not exposed to much in the way of bodily fluids and some of the realities that have to do with terminal illnesses and so on. And this is in a way, so that there are, in some of the Buddhist traditions, there people are enjoined to think about death as a kind of meditation to begin to develop a relationship to death. And in some of the shamanic traditions,
Yeah.
the, you're asked to think of death as being right at your left shoulder all the time. And what I'm in a men's group, and one of the guys in my men's group mentioned that coincidentally, we weren't talking about the books or anything, that he has an app on his phone called Croak. It's either Croak or Croaked. Have you heard of that?
No, I haven't, but it's a very
Well,
unique name.
yeah. Well, it turns out it's about croaking. It's about death. And what this is an app that simply reminds you at random times during the day that you're going to die.
Wow.
Yeah, and I haven't put it on my phone, but I'm thinking about it. I said, well, is the point of that then to I said, what's the point of it? But I sort of answered my own question, saying, well, I would imagine that it's to remind one to make the most of every moment they have. And certainly that's part of the value of being aware of death, I guess, is to realize how precious our lives are. And as we get older, it's a funny thing that as we get older, it seems like it's going by faster and faster.
Yes, definitely.
And we start to develop that appreciation for, wow, this is going by so fast, so quickly.
But I think also with children these days, David, I think they are more aware of death because social media, because TV, we see a lot more the results of death than maybe we did, 30, 40, 50 years ago. It's become something that children fear because they don't understand it. And so the anxiety with the news reports they hear, with disasters around the world being spread on media, I have found that for particularly teenage children that I counsel, there is a real anxiety about world events and death, and suicide has become very, very common here in Australia, which I'm sure it is in the US as well.
Yes, yes.
And I'm dealing with children that have had classmates that have suicided. And so we need to really address the fears behind death and the behaviors that develop through anxiety and the emotions, because our emotions, as we know, are very powerful, and children, as we know, always display their emotions behaviorally. So they can't often say, my tummy hurts or my heart is hurting. When I think about my friend or my dad, they play up or they do things that cause us to take notice of them if their needs aren't being met. So their emotions determine behaviours, and in a school situation or in a home situation, parents can see, teachers can see children as maybe being naughty, defiant, not wanting to participate in the family anymore. They might say things, an outburst, an angry outburst, and we go, oh, they've changed so much since the death and we don't know how to handle this child.
Yeah.
And this becomes frightening then for the parents, thinking their child is going to stay this way forever. And often they don't know how to address these behaviours that are really due to the child's hurting emotions. And I'm hoping that the book can address those as well.
Well, it really does. So you're reminding me that part of what happens to Benson the Boxer when his Labrador is
yes, Lucy the Labrador.
Yeah. Or a golden retriever, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah, and when he loses his friend, a lot of anger comes up for him, and he starts to. You said play up. Here we use the term act out. Maybe use that one as well. But yeah, kids, teenagers in particular, well, probably the full range of young children all the way up to teenagers, acting out may in fact be a symptom of grief and of anger, of some kind of anger about the death. And just coincidentally, you know, yesterday was the Oscar ceremony here in the U.S.
Yeah.
Imagine at least some people in Australia probably pay attention to those as well, right?
I'm a big fan.
Yeah, well, we're big fans in my family, and we see lots of movies. So I actually went to the movies yesterday to see the Oscar shorts, the documentary shorts, and one of the documentary shorts, which I recommend to anybody who's interested in this topic, was about death, and it was highlighting a program in connection with the University of California at San Francisco Hospital, where they have a special program, a special kind of what's the name for it, to prepare. It's before they go into hospice, but it's sort of a middle stage of.
A palliative care stage?
Thank you. That's the word I'm missing. Palliative care, right? And so they show some real people going through the process of trying to deal with dying. And there was also a special hospice place called the Zen Hospice in San Francisco, in a wonderful old Victorian house. And people volunteers as well as medical professionals who are well trained to just be with people. And so it's a wonderful, wonderfully instructive thing, and it's nice. It's reassuring to know that there are some resources out there for people in the final stages of their life, and there are people who are willing to sit with them as they struggle with the big questions. You know, what's going to happen? How much pain am I going to be in? What happens after I die? What do they do to my body after I'm gone? Just really nitty-gritty anxieties that people had, and the family who come into the room to be with them. And it's very moving and just very real. And I guess that's one of the values of death, is that it forces us to get real.
It does. And it's when we acknowledge and when we identify and name and address our emotions surrounding death that healing starts to begin. And it's not easy to move forward, but acknowledging, particularly, you know, this is what I'm feeling, and it hurts. It just hurts.
Yeah.
But it is, I'm just going back for a little bit on behaviours that I think we don't like to see children hurt. It distresses parents to see their children hurting.
Yes.
So what I'm finding, when children are hurting due to the loss of a parent, it's very easy now to hand over the iPad or the phone and put on a game or a movie or a distraction. And so the child sits in the corner and plays relatively peacefully. And so, you know, distraction is there. They're not crying, they're happy, they're enjoying their time on the technology we provide for them. But I personally don't think this is beneficial to moving through the stages of loss. And I'm not talking about Kubler-Ross's or the 5 stages of grief, because we know that people oscillate between all the stages of grief. It's not a set pattern that we go through.
Right.
But in saying that, just distracting a child so we don't see them cry, or so they're actually sanitized from the process of watching people grieve, and not allowing them to acknowledge it hurts and cry and act out, and explaining to them that this is part of the grief process. I think we do our children a big disservice. Just distracting doesn't heal from grief. It needs to be acknowledged, as I said, identified, named and addressed, and then move forward, rather than just give them something to take away the pain.
Yeah. You know, another idea that occurred to me as I was reading the book is that it could be of value to kids who have not suffered grief yet. And I
Yes.
wonder if you've seen that effect of it, kind of giving them a mental map, if you will, for some of
Yes.
these processes that they can then fall back on later.
That's right. Well, being prepared for anything, having a little bit of knowledge before we don't go into an exam, a test, and bring out the books the day that we walk in. We do the preparation beforehand. So having some prior knowledge of what they could experience can start to form memories of that makes sense now. So yes, definitely in a classroom situation where you have a number of children and we talk about grief and loss, and we talk about death, explaining the fear reactions that can develop in a brain that is suffering loss can be, it's the psychoeducation before the event happens, if you like. So I totally agree with you,
Yeah.
David. Yeah, it can be some
Yeah,
real benefit.
because as soon as you started talking about classroom, I realized that, oh, it's already happening in that setting when some member of the class has experienced a death. And but people who are on the outskirts hearing the story, if the story is being read by the teacher,
Mm,
they will be vicariously learning.
mm,
And it
yeah.
makes me wonder, in terms of the sales and marketing of your book, I have mixed feelings about it. I'm not sure if it's a good idea to just to be saying to parents, you ought to read this to your kids. Even
Mm,
though nobody's died, this is a good
that's
children's
right.
book. What do you
Yeah.
think?
Definitely. I would like to think if I had my time over again as a young mum, my children are older now, but if I had that time over again, I would definitely have had that book there to open the conversations.
Yeah,
We talk about sex with children, we open up a lot of conversations, but we often don't open a conversation about death until we are in that loss and grief and traumatic situation, and then we go, I don't know what to do. And people often say to me, what do I say? We've heard so-and-so's lost their loved one. What do I say? Because we don't know the words to use. Do we say too much? Do we say too little? And we all say sometimes silence is the best, which it is, but there still needs to be an acknowledgement that someone is hurting, or else they feel neglected. And so having this preparation even beforehand for teaching children before a loss happens in a family of how we can move forward. The book was actually written with therapists in mind, David. Partway
uh-huh.
through the book, we have Uncle Boris, who is the uncle of Benson, comes and he does therapy work with him. If you were a new practitioner in the area of grief and loss and not sure what to say, how to manage a client in grief, the questions that Uncle Boris asks, the silence, just listening, the opening up of conversation that is woven throughout the book. This book is like an onion. There's many, many layers to it.
Mhm.
And so just the process that a therapist can read of how to manage a client, how to help a client is actually interwoven through that story as well. A parent can then learn without any counselling training on grief and loss therapy on how to sit with grief, how to acknowledge the moment, how to ask appropriate questions to open up dialogue where we can then move into that moving forward process. So that's all interwoven within the story as well.
Yeah, there's so many threads there, and I'm glad you're reminding me of all of those. It's kind of a genius, I have to say. That maybe you were channeling some kind of wisdom here, because it is such a universal book. My wife's a huge reader, very omnivorous reader, and just tears through all kinds of books. And as a consequence, we have grandchildren now, and she's got a book corner like you would find in a schoolroom, with a nice beanbag chair and one of those book racks that the books go up laying on top of each other. And so the kids will come and pick out books, and it's a very short time between when you're reading books to a child and the child starts to read. Some children read very early. So our grandchildren are mostly at the place where they'll go over there and they'll pull out a book and either read it themselves without any commentary from an adult, or they'll ask to have it read. I'm going to talk to my wife about this because she's got strong feelings about everything, and she's also a trained teacher. But I think we should just put this over there and see who gravitates to it and how it goes. I'm going to suggest that to her. I should have done all that before this interview. I'm having all these great ideas now that I'm talking to you, because I would have liked to have told you how that went. So, one of the questions that comes up is, one of the things we should mention to people is that in the workbook, in the manual for teachers and parents and therapists that we're going to discuss in a bit, there also a section in there for kids, and the manual identifies sort of two age groups. So tell us about the two age groups and your thoughts about that.
Okay, so the first age group for the activities, and the activities are reproducible, photocopiable sheets that therapists and teachers can photocopy, reproduce. The copyright allows that to happen. I've specifically allowed that to happen, knowing that these sheets need to be, because they're full color, they're attractive. There are two workbooks, as you've mentioned, and they're associated with the manual. The original idea was to have the workbooks separate, but then we combined them so people weren't buying 4 different items. So that's what we can do. Some of the worksheets overlap in the fact that there is a more difficult version of it in, say, the senior book. So the first book was, let's say, for 4 to 8-year-olds. Then the second one is between 8 and 12-plus-year-olds. Tried to make it age appropriate, so there is more drawing. Children tend to draw and colour, so the spaces are bigger. The language is more simple, but it's not a workbook that is done with a child on its own. We don't leave the child to do the workbook and go away and say, oh, finish that page. It's not that sort of workbook. These activity sheets are discussion starters. They are openers for therapists and teachers to move beyond the worksheet. Sometimes we're not sure what to say. We talk about emotions, what happens inside our body. So this is the beginning of further discussion. You could take the worksheet as it is, but the idea was, this is how we begin. Let's talk about our emotions. What happens inside your body when you're feeling scared and anxious? So it goes through a lot of pictures of a little boy. So it moves from Benson's fears to a little boy's fears or a little girl's fears. It moves from Benson's fear reactions to a little girl. So I've taken it from the child and moving it to Benson, first of all, neutralizes, if you like, of want of a better word, to talk about Benson's fears first, then they can transfer those feelings to themselves. There's a brain maze in the senior book, and that brain maze, while there's a diagram of it, it has the amygdala screaming to run and hide, and the idea of the brain maze is they start from the bottom where they go through panic path and stress street. They need to move through the brain maze to come out to the prefrontal cortex. This is where thinking and analysing and problem solving and working things through happens. That was the idea around that. Now it's not. It's just to get children to realise that when they start to talk grief, when they start to talk their emotions, most children want to turn off. as adults, we want to turn off, because when we talk how we feel about a situation, it hurts. And I always use the analogy of getting a splinter, a prickle out of a finger. And when we have a splinter in our finger, it hurts. But what do we do to get it out? We need to get a needle. We need to get a sharp object to start digging. And that digging actually hurts worse for a time. Until then, we get that out and we start to heal. We can leave it in our finger to start festering and becoming pussy and becoming quite inflamed. But by moving back and reaching into that experience again and moving past the amygdala, that fear-based center, that alarm center of the brain, and moving around to discussing and acknowledging and identifying, even though it's painful at the time, if we move in very small steps in therapy, never big jumps, step-by-step processes, then we can see a healing, because it's the fear process is taken gradually. So as we get the splinter out, healing begins.
That's a great metaphor. Yeah. Yeah, that makes so much sense. And it's a metaphor that a child can understand.
Wow.
You reminded me of something that I thought was quite interesting in the book. And for people who are watching this on YouTube, I want to show them, which is that the book is very much a story about a dog, Benson the Boxer, who loses his friend Lucy. And the last color print shows a little boy and a little girl. I hope people can see this. I'm trying to look at it in the monitor to see if
I can see it, yeah.
Okay. And that's the last thing. There's no words, no commentary, but if it could really speak to the child to kind of suggest that this is okay, this is what happens, this may be how you're feeling.
So in the manual, in the beginning of the manual, there are some questions that a therapist or a teacher or a parent might like to ask the child, as in, who do you think this could be? Have you ever felt like that? What do you think they're thinking about? Who do you think would come to sit with them if someone was sitting like that? And so there's the manual explains some questions we can use by those pages. And yes, no words, because it's up to them. When the child looks at that, they can go, oh, that looked like my friend Sally when she was sitting and feeling sad. And then we'd say, so have you ever felt like that? And that is, again, is another opening for discussion, because it moves from Benson to then themselves, seeing themselves in that page or seeing a friend of theirs in those pages.
Yes, yes. So I want to focus a little bit more on the manual. The purpose of the manual, you've kind of already spoken about that, and you see that as being useful to different audiences, for parents, teachers, therapists.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as a tool really to help facilitate conversation with the grieving child.
Yeah, I believe psychoeducation is really important in the process of loss and grief. Those aha moments we get when we suddenly realize we're not going crazy. We have older people in general, if they come to us, I think, I'm going mad. I just feel I'm going crazy. I can't get through this. And younger children just say, I just want the hurt to stop. I just want it to go away. And explaining to them from a brain perspective and giving them some little exercises in the manual to do, it starts to become apparent that this process is a normal process. The manual also has some of the worksheets talk about plan A and plan B, and there is a maze I've put in the workbook, a maze of Benson wanting to get to Lucy. And the maze is actually a dead end. It doesn't go anywhere. It's a complete But when they go back, they see there's another opening down the bottom. And down the bottom, there's some little pictures of Benson's friends. There's the bear, there's the cat, there's other people that support him. And what the idea of this is, we may not have with us the person, our loved one, our father or mother may not be there, but there are always people that we can go to as plan B. Is a very broad concept, but there's always a plan B where we can help us move forward. We might not have plan A in place anymore, but we can move through to plan B. And remembering, David, this is not just a book for loss. It's a book for people with children that go through divorce, situations of divorce and separation with their parents. So the activities there, one of the pages shows that there's a little girl sitting beside her house is burned down. Another little girl is in a wheelchair. She's had an accident. Loss doesn't just encompass death.
Yeah,
Loss is
good point.
when lives change. So that can be, and I'm from Christchurch, New Zealand originally, and they've had some horrendous earthquakes there. There's been a loss of life. And that was part of my thinking, putting this book together. When we live in a community where there are bushfires, where there are floods, where there are earthquakes, where there are natural disasters that take a whole community is affected, how do we move through that with children? War areas. Let's talk about people that live in nations that suffer war, and there's loss of life. It's not just a child's whole sense of normal can become different if they are a refugee that leaves a country, for example, and comes to live in a new area. That again is a loss. Whatever we leave behind is a loss.
Yeah.
So we think very probably loss being death, but it's much broader than that, much broader.
Yeah, excellent point. And so you cover some of those possibilities in the workbook.
Absolutely, yes, we do. We look, we definitely look at what happens in a situation where you could apply the activities to any situation of loss, for example. Some are specific to death, but not all of them. I have a picture I'm going to show you here, a picture of a game and that game talks about different situations of when we experience loss. And as you go through, you roll the die and you move on to those these are different numbers. And for example, it says here that when you have to do a school talk and you choose to run out of the classroom and not do it, move back a space, because fear can change the way we even want to behave with normal stuff we would normally do. Now, that's just not talking about the death of a loved one. That can be, I don't want to go to school because my school was in an earthquake and I feel nervous about that now. I don't want to be in that classroom anymore because something happened in there. And in America, you have a lot of situations where there are shootings in schools. How does a child go back to school when there's been a shooting in a school? We don't have that problem yet in Australia. I hope we don't.
I hope you don't either.
Yeah, it's how do we get children to move forward and change the narrative so they can then approach life in a way that's not entirely fearful again.
Yeah, those are real big questions. But this could be a good place to start, and there might be an idea there for you to help us out here to write a book, one or more books that take on that sort of situation that teachers could use.
So big, isn't it? I mean, that's right. I mean, this book, David, is just a beginning for what we really need. And this is, as I say, a discussion starter to help open up some of those discussions with a worksheet. And let's talk about that further. Let's go over it. This topic is so broad. It's
Do you have ideas of other places that you want to take it or other materials that you want to develop?
Yes, I certainly have other books on the go at the moment. There's a book on shame I am doing. There's one on guilt I'm doing. There's one on failure I'm doing. It's just finding time to do it, David. But yes, I've already got all the artwork done for my next one, and that hopefully I'm hoping will be out by the end of the year.
Oh,
It's
wonderful.
yeah, just but in the grief and loss area, I would like to see that there are more worksheets developed for specifically the older teenage years as well. They are already experiencing some traumatic situations with their peers suiciding in Australia here. That's becoming a really traumatic thing for school children that between 15 and 17-year-olds, 13 and 15,
Right.
there's a lot of suicide that happen, and I don't think we have enough resources out there about suicide and how that specifically affects a classroom of students, teachers, along with naturally the parents of the loved one that's no longer there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that sounds like a wonderful direction, and it's good that you are moving in that direction, because clearly there's a great need on the one hand, and on the other hand, you show a real talent and gift, I think, for uh, putting good information out there in a way that's digestible.
Yes, simple. I'm hoping it probably seems deceptively simple, but that was the idea. And the
Yeah.
worksheets are simple because the worksheets are not to pass a grade or pass a test. If a child is going through a situation of grief, to add some more uncontrollable incongruence into their lives where they feel they can't achieve because it's too hard, I don't want to have to think about it, they wouldn't want to even look at it. So this is not specifically grade appropriate for schools to say, oh, that doesn't fit with the grade of the level of teaching we'd be doing for testing. It's not designed for that. It's designed that everyone can achieve, everyone can draw something, everyone, no matter their ability, whether there's learning difficulties, whether there is the brightest child in the class, it has to be a situation where there is no threat in doing a worksheet, because further threats to add to an already troubled, anxious mind will simply turn a child off. So definitely the activities are simple for the purpose of enjoyment, bit of fun, discussion starting. Just pop your ideas down and let's then talk about your ideas, not to pass any benchmark testing of a specific school age appropriate
Right.
level of academic achievement.
Yeah. Have you gotten any user testing, if you will, feedback from children, from
Children love it.
teachers, from
Yes.
therapists?
Yes, everyone that uses it here in Australia, they're thoroughly enjoying it. And when we explain how it's to be used, with just the discussion starters, yes, in fact, I'm meeting in Brisbane a family from South Africa in the next couple of weeks because they have suffered some terrible loss, and I will be meeting up with them and going through the book with them as well and explaining more on how they can use that. And it doesn't need one-on-one explanations because the manual explains how to use it. There are ideas there to use in, for example, sand play therapy. So people are taking the ideas, and the feedback is very positive with, yes, that got them talking about this. Thank you for that idea. We were able to develop this from that, particularly as you pointed out before, the picture of the little boy and the little girl at the back of the storybook. The child we were counselling was able to identify with that, and they sit like that themselves. They love the paintings, they love the artwork involved with it. Yeah. Every page is attractive, and they just say thank you. There's finally a resource out there that's simple enough to be used in therapy, but teachers are saying, yep, we are beginning to use this in our schools.
Yeah. Well, you're going to have to start going to some international conferences, to help spread it more.
Yeah. Yes. In fact, I was told that the other week that I need to maybe come to the US. I was,
Yeah. It's such a bloody long way away, though.
it is a long way, and look, it's just, I guess it's for me, it's finding out when the conferences are on and being tapped into those areas there to be able to share the resource, because it's becoming, yeah, very very invaluable for many therapists here, which is lovely.
Yeah.
And particularly parents. I worked for some time with parents that they have chosen homeschooling as their education for their children. And the book was actually written while I was working as an educator in that area, as well as doing my study. And there were some tragic losses on some of the farmland outback, you would call them ranches maybe in the US, where there might be a nanny, or where there may be just the mother that's educating the child, and a tragedy happens on the farm. And where do they go for a resource? What do they do? They can't get into the city, into a town, into a local village to get to a therapist as they would like. So this book has become a book that has been put into the centre of Australia, for example, to help families get through situations of loss. It's part of the life of a farm to experience loss, but sometimes the tragedies are quite overwhelming for children. And what do we do with it? Where do we go?
Yeah.
So really great for homeschool families as well.
Yeah. Yeah. That's an interesting point that Australia is so vast, and that there are people who are living in very thinly populated areas, right?
Yes, very much so. And they're school of the air, or, they might only get to see a town once a month, maybe, for example. Australia, the middle of Australia is so vast, so
Yeah.
big.
I've seen movies that kind of get that point across. Yeah. And I know it's such a I'd love to go to Australia, but it's just too long a trip for me at this point in my life, I think. And is it also burdensome to go to Europe? Is that a long ways away as well?
Well, it is a long way. We are a long way away, but there are plans. Some of my contacts are in Europe, and there are definitely plans to take this book into Europe, definitely. Um, I'm hoping to get to Spain, which is part of that continent, in the near future, and meeting up with some psychologists over there, and
Yeah, good.
that hopefully it's just getting the word out, David. It's
Right.
difficult to not get word out there, and have people recognise that this is a resource that, if it's a one-off resource, we go, oh yeah, okay. But when it's a resource we can use over and over and over, because those pages are totally reproducible, I'm hoping people can see the value in the story, along with the manual book, to go, we can use this
Yeah.
continuously, for it's not just something you read and put on the shelf.
Yeah. Well, I also lots of podcast interviews like this, since
Yes, thank you.
this medium is one
Yeah,
way to cover vast distances that you don't
yeah.
have to physically be there.
That's right. That's right. But if any of
Yeah.
your listeners, would like to contact me more, please put up my details, and they can certainly contact me, and we can see what we can do with even Skype or whatever, with visiting, because I do travel a little, and so if I was ever in the areas that they were in, I would certainly come to visit, and we could arrange a meeting with.
But when you say put out your details, what, your website or
Well, yes, there's
your email address or what?
yes, email address. I I don't know if I say it on the, or if we write it down somewhere. How do you go with, how does it happen that you can give people my details, David? How does that look from your end?
Oh, on my end, I can read them out on the show. That's how it would happen.
Yes. Well, my email is Cortection, CORTXION @gmail.com.
Yeah.
Cortection is the name of my business. Cortection, the cortex of the brain. And what do we do as therapists? we connect, the connection with people. That's where the name came from. So it's cortxion@gmail.com. And I do have two websites. There is an Education of Brain Smart Enterprises website and a Cortection website that they can have a look at as well. And if they just typed Karen Ferry into a Google search, they will certainly come up with my name.
Yeah, great. Well, is there anything else you'd like to say before we close it off here? It feels like we've covered a lot of ground, but there might be something more.
Well, probably from a therapist's perspective and an educator's perspective, it's once again, just want to reinforce that if we just let children move through their grief in a natural progression, most children do move through grief, as most people do, but it's those people that get stuck that we really need to look out for. Grief is a natural process and it can't be dictated to. We experience silences. We allow children to experience grief in their own way, in their own time. We find that adults grieve 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But children, the term that I've read is puddle jumping, where we go from a child will run off and play, be happy with their friends, come back, and their behaviours might be quite obnoxious. They might then start to cry. Then they'll go off and play again. Then they'll come back. And this puddle jumping is, they say, as a result of a child's brain not being able to take on the full weight of grief directly all at one time. So the brain processes it gradually. And this book simply helps a child to process the grief gradually, acknowledging it, identifying it, not meaning that we have to take a child and sit them down and you must read this. Because if a child, for example, has an aversion to dogs, if there is something there, we need to remove the book and try some other way. There are many ways to go through grief. This is just one psychoeducational tool that can lead a child from a process, a stage of being stuck to moving forward. But let's acknowledge grief in the respectful way that we can, talk about it, make it become part of a family and a school discussion so that it doesn't hit so hard.
Yeah, that's great. And I want to let people know that we spoke before this interview and that you're going to be advertising your book on the Shrink Wrap Radio website. So I want to encourage people to go there, and that's a good source for it because it might not be in every bookstore at this point. So this is a good way to get it.
Yeah, mostly Amazon, Booktopia, Book Depository. It's across the board now. It's been out since August last year. It's across the board. They have all those sites here. Yeah. So David, I just want to thank you for allowing me to be on this show and making this resource known to your audience. And I really appreciate this opportunity.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you again and to be a conduit for this really important information. So Karen Ferry, I want to thank you for being my guest again today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
It's an absolute pleasure, David, and all the best to you and your listeners.